Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Claire Bradley, and I am the Director of Irish Studies here at the International Institute of Genealogical Studies. Welcome to our first virtual meeting for 2025. Can you believe we are a quarter of the way through this century? I feel old. What I thought we would do today is go back to basics. We've got a lot of new people who've been coming recently, and I thought, even though all of you have done a lot of Irish research already, that there's no harm in going back and reviewing some more basic things, especially stuff that we might forget about. So today's Back to Basics is going to be about names and spellings and variations and so on. And you're very welcome to chip in with your own comments as always. I always want this to be a talking point rather than just sitting there listening. Does anyone have any particular comments or questions that they want to bring up before we get into the topic? No? Okay, great. Share my screen. I will be doing some demoing in this class as well, so I'll be flipping back and forth between here and my browser. Okay, hopefully you can see that in the right format. Just give me a thumbs up, please, if you can. Great, thank you. Okay. So, as I said, I wanted to talk about names today because when we consider the past, one thing that we get very hung up on in the modern world is being precise. We always would correct someone if they pronounced our name wrong, or if they spelt our name wrong, or they misattributed us to the wrong country or something like that. And in the past, people were much vaguer about these things. But there were some things that they did do. And one of the ones that I wanted to get into first was that they used naming patterns. So before we actually talk into the nitty-gritty of actual names, families in Ireland had a pattern. Now, this isn't a hard and fast everybody did this rule, but it is quite commonplace. And I've looked into it in some of my families, and I've put a link there at the bottom, which I will I'll stick into the chat as well for you. Go back so that you can see it. But basically, what happened was, in a family, they'd have children. The first boy who was born would be named after his paternal grandfather, so his father's father. The second boy would be named after the mother's father, the maternal grandfather. The third boy named after his own father. And that's the case in my grandfather's family. He was the third boy, and he was Michael, and his dad was Michael. And the fourth boy would be named after siblings of the parents, or whichever saint's feast day is his birthday or beside it. So you do get lots of boys called Patrick, born on the 17th of March, which is St. Patrick's Day. And you also commonly get them with the middle name Joseph, because the feast of St. Joseph is the 19th of March. Things I never thought I would need to learn as a genealogist, saints' feast days, but apparently sometimes it comes up. I found somebody in one of my families who was called Gertrude, not exactly a name you expect in Ireland, but turned out she was born on the feast of St. Gertrude, and that's why she got that name. They were also a family which had an enormous number of children, so I guess they were running out of ideas. Now, when it came to girls, there was a similar pattern, but it started with the maternal grandmother, then went on to the maternal grandfather, then the mother, and then again siblings, or whichever feast day saints are relevant. So you can't describe it all the time, but if you have a family and you know from, say, the census that they had 10 children and you've only found 5 of them, think about these things. If you know some details, if you're looking for other people in the family, look to the siblings as a parents and go, okay, they probably use some of those names again. And similarly, when you're trying to go backwards, if you don't know the names of people, look at the children's names and go, okay, I'm going to try these names with both the mother's surname and the father's surname and see if I can see anything there that links in. This does also lead, in small places, to lots of people called after their grandfather. So if, for example, if you've got a family where the father's called Thomas O'Shea and he's got 4 sons, the chances are that he's going to have at least 1, but possibly even 4 grandsons called Thomas O'Shea. So You know, that is not helpful in a small area when you're trying to sort people into different families. There might be multiple people with the same name, and it might be because they have a common grandfather. One other important thing to consider with this naming pattern is that you might not have all of the children in a family. So if you're trying to make a leap backwards and you say, okay, well, the first boy was called James, so therefore there's a good chance his paternal grandfather was called James. Consider, could they have had an infant who died that they called James, and then they had another child called Frank, and then after that they had another boy called James, and they said, okay, we're going to go again with James. And this, again, very strange in our modern world, the sensibility of using a name again after a child has died, but extremely common in the past. Now, you'll never have two children alive with the same name that are being used. You know, you're not going to have two boys called James. But definitely, if one has died. So if you're looking at baptismal records in particular, and you say, oh, here's a couple and they seem to have had two children with the same name, almost certainly the first one will have died, and that's what's happened. Now, there is a little bit of an exception with that, which is the name Mary. And you do sometimes get lots of girls in a family called Mary something, Mary Jane, Mary Margaret, and they're all known by the middle name, but Mary is their first name. My great grandmother's family, there were a number of girls, and we always knew her as Agnes. But when I got into the records, I found she was Mary Agnes, and in fact, she had 3 sisters who were Mary something, and all known by their middle name. And then they had a 5th girl who was called Georgina. No Mary. And I'm like, what happened there? That's really weird. You called everyone else Mary, but they left her with Georgina. So you consider that people might be using their middle name all the time. That's very common. Okay, let's go on then to first names and talk generally about nicknames and versions of names. The first thing I want to explain is the use of mór and beag, which are 2 Irish words which mean big and small or little. And we use them in Irish a bit like you would use senior and junior. Now, of course, when we talk about senior and junior in English, we're usually referring to 2 men who are father and son, and they have exactly the same name. Michael Bradley Jr., Michael Bradley Sr. Now, the mór and beag usually used with the first name, but it does generally delineate 2 people who have precisely the same name, but they might not be father and son. They might be uncle and nephew. They might be, you know, two other relations. So almost certainly going to be 2 different generations of men with the same name. But you see this sometimes in Griffith's Valuation, our mid-19th century census substitute, and you see it in the tithe allotment books, and sometimes it's translated into English. And so you'll see big after someone's name. I had some records from my own family where there was somebody called James O'Rourke, and in brackets it said big after his name. And then also on the page there was a James O'Rourke without big written after his name. So sometimes the beag is implied by the presence of a mór, if you know what I mean. But actually what we're seeing there is that those people are using Irish in their day-to-day life still. And so that person would be known in Irish as Seamus O'Rourke, and it would be Seamus Mór O'Rourke to indicate that there's some other person called Seamus O'Rourke in the area. And this sometimes gets translated into English as Big Jim. So we see that's quite common still in Ireland. You'd see someone in their name is James. They might be known as Seamus, but they might also be known as Big Jim. So just to explain that when you see it, it doesn't always mean senior and junior. It can do, but it can mean uncle and nephew or something like that as well. Now, also nicknames, and this really comes into play when you're looking at records that where someone maybe has used a variant of their name. And I have found in the past that, say, Margaret's a good example here. So Margaret in its traditional spelling, and you might be familiar with Maggie as a derivation, and maybe you're familiar with Peggy, but a lot of people are not familiar with Daisy as a derivation of Margaret, which it absolutely is. And then Meg and Margot are other ones as well. All of those names. So if you're looking for Margaret, you can't find Margaret. Have you looked under all of these names? And also consider how it's pronounced. So I was looking for a Margaret once and I was tearing my hair out, couldn't find her in the census. And I thought, this woman should definitely be in the census. And I tried all of these options. And then I realized that I hadn't tried this, the way it's pronounced, Margaret. The middle bit is missing. And I looked for it under that. And there it was, with this spelling, which of course is not correct. But that's the way they had written it on the census form. And therefore, that was the way it was transcribed. So think about how something could be pronounced. You may have looked at the parish registers for the Roman Catholic Church, and often they have got them in Latin. Now, it won't be just the first names that are in Latin. The surname will always be in English, but the first name could be in Latin. The rest of and the parents' names can be in Latin. So there's a few things to consider here. One is that the ending of the name might be in a Latin case structure. So you might see Brigida or Brigitam, and it'll be because the way it's written is, you know, the daughter of so and so and so. So puts the Bridget into the genitive case in Latin, possessive case. So, you know, I see this very commonly in user trees on Ancestry. People have put in the Latin because they don't realize that they think it's a different name that they're using. They see Johannes and they write that down, and it's just John. And another one that confuses people is James is Jacobus in Latin, which isn't at all like it, but you see it with the Jacobite wars in Scotland, King James. People don't necessarily know that, and why would they? Not everyone has studied Latin, but so they see different spell. And sometimes I see people have put in two children in a generation, and they've put one in the Latin name and the other one is in the English name, and it's the same person. So I want to mention this link. And again, I'll put these into the chat when I come off the screen share so you can see all these links. But here's an example of one now that's in Latin and in Irish and in English. So Timothy, the English version, and of course Tim or Timmy, very common nickname there. But in Irish, that would be Tig. Or you might see it as Taddy or Thaddy, and that comes from the Latin Thaddeus. So all of those names take it as the same person. I was looking recently for a client and I found somebody in the records. Her father was called, the several generations back person's father was called Timothy Cotter in Cork, which would be a very common name. And then I found some records that referred to him as Tig Moore. So obviously he had a son as well, or somebody else in the next generation called Tig. So yeah, and you might not have realized that when you saw this word written down that it would be pronounced Tig. It's a bit of a strange one. And you do sometimes see it also spelled Tadgh. It's the same name.
Claire, question?
Yeah, go ahead.
Or a comment. My observation in looking at some of the older Roman Catholic parish records was how common what I would consider to be nicknames were used for the children or the parents. You know, Tom and Ned.
Yeah.
Is there
Yeah.
something going on there where they're
No,
so familiar with their parishioners that that's how they enter their records? And even
it could be
somebody whose
that.
name is Ed and then Ned and then Edward, and it's all
Yeah.
over the place.
And Edward's a confusing one because you always have to look for Edmund and Edmond as well
Hmm.
as Edward, and they can all be interchangeable even though they aren't the
Yeah,
same name. It's just that the W and the M look very similar when they're written in cursive handwriting.
sure.
Yeah, you do. You definitely see nicknames included. And it might just be that there's loads of people with that name in the area and they've gone, oh yeah, we're going to call this person that. But a lot of the time, abbreviations in particular, so say you see Pat instead of Patrick,
Hmm.
it'll be to do with ink. They're obsessed with
Hmm.
saving ink in the past. So if they
Sure.
can abbreviate any little letter missing, I've seen Michael abbreviated to MICH, no AE, and then a small L up in the air.
Hmm. Hmm.
They've left out two letters. Like, how much ink did that save, guys? But I wanted to mention the Michael thing because sometimes Michael can get mixed up with Nicholas because of that. So
Hmm.
MICH small l and Nicholas NICH small l, and particularly in Latin where the Michael might have a case ending that's added an AS at the end of it. So
Hmm.
I have sometimes I've even misread it myself, Nicholas Michael. not two names you would expect in any way to be mixed up, but they do get mixed up. So a lot of it is to do with abbreviating for ink space. So you see William as WM.
Mm.
So there's that to consider too. But a lot of it is just yeah, they're saving space. They know the person's called Ned, so they've just written that down. They, you know, remember that what we think of as official today, oh, I must write in my full official name. People weren't as focused on that sort of thing in the past. It wasn't as relevant, you know. They didn't have a copy of their birth cert, most likely, if they had one. They never needed to produce identification of any kind at any point in their life, you know.
Okay.
One thing as well, if you're looking at the civil records, lots of babies have their birth registered as unknown or no first name and their surname. So in the indexes, if you're ever looking at the physical indexes, it'll say male Riley or female Murphy. But what they did when they produced irishgenealogy.ie was they decided to just put unknown plus surname. And this is an example of it here from 1882. This is a number of children born in the Rotunda Hospital, which was a large maternity hospital, still exists now. It's the oldest in the world. And lots of babies were born there every day, obviously. And the hospital had the responsibility for registering their births. And even though they would have had their own records, I guess they would just somehow go down to the clerk's office and go, yeah, John and Agnes Moran had a child there, and it was a girl. And they just didn't bother writing in what they, you know, they didn't go back and say to Agnes, that's a lovely baby, what are you going to call her? They didn't do any of that. They just went, yeah, girl, born in the Rotunda Hospital. So if you're not finding someone in the records, definitely just do a search for the surname. And it takes time, of course, to go through all those records and see what you can find. But I did this. My great grandfather, Peter Riley, he was a bit of a mystery to me. In fact, he's still a mystery. But I have identified that he was born in the Rotunda Hospital and he's registered as unknown Riley in the records. And sometimes they would add in later, there was a column here that's cut off here, but they would add in the child's name if it was registered later on. But most of the time, the person didn't ever have any need to go back and register that, so they just went through their whole life, you know, with their name, but their birth certificate didn't have their actual name on it. It becomes a problem. It's helping somebody who was trying to do a citizenship claim for which they were totally entitled to. Their grandfather was Irish, but he had one of these birth certificates that they knew it was him from the parents and other information, but it didn't have his first name. So they had to present other information and try and go back and get it added retrospectively, even though he was dead a really long time, so that it could be added to their citizenship claim. So just try out for interest on Irish genealogy, pick a surname, don't put in a first name, and test it out so you can see how common it is. Another one in the same vein is nuns. And we might be looking for nuns in our family because often nuns have an obituary, says something interesting about their lives. But nuns, when they entered religious life, of course, they take a religious name, and they are often then just known in the past, not so much nowadays, but they're often just known as Sister Mary Josephine for the rest of their life. And that, you know, you never hear their surname or their real name. And what I found, to my surprise and horror, is that many nuns, their deaths are registered in their nun name. And I'm going to demonstrate this for you now. Let me just hop over to... No, that's the wrong thing. I'm going to unshare for a second. Hang on. These things never work as well as you want them to in the moment, do they? Okay. So if we just put sister into the first box and click death, and we don't even have to put any years in here or any places, because I just want to show you this. Tell it you're not a robot. And here are 901 death results for someone who's apparently got the first name sister. And you can see, these are all quite recent, obviously, but you can see here all these women. Sister Norbert, there's a terrible one to go through life with, hey? Sister Norbert from Cork. There she is. And look, here, it does have her surname on the record when we go in, but it doesn't have it in the index. And Sister Norbert could have been anything. Her first name could have been anything at all. And we don't know what it is. Her real name has been obscured, which is, I think, terrible indictment of the way the church was honored in the past. This woman deserves to have had her real name on her death certificate. And I've seen ones where it doesn't even have their surname, just their religious first name. So if you do find something like this, what I would be doing straight away with Sister Norbert Kennedy is I'd be going into the newspapers and I'd be looking for an obituary for Sister Norbert. Or sometimes Sister Norbert, her parents, people were very proud when they had a nun or a priest in the family. And in the parents' obituaries, or even their sisters and brothers' obituaries, it would specifically highlight the mother of Sister Norbert or the mother of Father Patrick Keenan. And so that's sometimes a way to figure out who these people are. Nuns often get an obituary where another single woman might not have had something in the newspaper when they died. So I just wanted to also highlight that, which is particularly strange. Okay, let's go on to talk then about surnames now. Can you see the slideshow okay again? Yeah. Okay. So what are surnames? Much more variation in them in the past than there are today, of course. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One of them is illiteracy. People would go and they'd register a life event, but they didn't know how their surname was spelt. So if their surname was Clark, they didn't know whether there was an E on the end or not. And the person at the office would just spell it the way they thought it was spelt and do it there that way. There's a huge variation in how names can be spelled. And of course, if someone was a native Irish speaker, they might not how to, they might know, they might be literate in Irish, but they might not be literate in English. And therefore they might not know how their name is spelt in English again. So you want to, really the key thing here is that you want to make sure you know all of your possibilities for how a surname could look. And don't get too attached to the version you have now. I've seen people discount things on the basis of a slightly different spelling, which is a huge mistake. I was working with a man once, his surname was Ganley, Ganley. And Ireland's a very small country. And I said to him, oh, there's a famous auctioneering house, real estate called Ganley's. Are you any connection to them? And he said, oh no, they've no E in their name. It couldn't be related to us. And I thought, oh, okay, I wouldn't discount it wholeheartedly on that basis. And actually, for my own curiosity, I did check and they were related. It's just at one point they went to start spelling an E with an E, and at another point they didn't have an E anymore. I'm going to also demonstrate here John Grenham's website for you. So let me just pull that up. So this is johngrenham.com. We've talked about it before. I'm going to put in O'Rourke as a demonstration of one that has a lot of different variation. And John has some great stuff on his website. If you haven't looked at it before, it's definitely worth your while. Here he's compiled a map, a heat map, based on Griffith's valuation of places where we see O'Rourke. And here he shows the O'Rourke variant just in Griffith's valuation, and you see Rourke, lots of different ways. Then that's not even considering the spellings in Irish. So the most usual spelling in Irish is this, O'Rourke. But all of these, look at them. I picked this one on purpose, of course. There's lots of, not everything has this many variations, but you have to check these. Now, some websites are going to do sound checks for you, and some websites are not going to do sound checks for you. One of the prime candidates for not doing sound checks is this, the National Archives Census website, which is as you can tell by just looking at it, a very old website at this point. They have been promising for some time a new website, and it hasn't happened yet, but I'm hopeful that it's going to happen this year, and then next year we're going to have a new census release in Ireland, the 1926 census, and hopefully it'll all be nicely slotted in there. But in this website, when you put in a surname, it doesn't give you all the variations. So let's have a look at Mahoney. Okay, now Mahoney spelt like that, but there's also a possibility of Mahoney with an E. And there's also O'Mahony, which can have the E or not. So a way to get around this on this website is to put a little asterisk in between the N and the Y. And that will bring up any variants that have a letter in between those or multiple letters. So you can see there's a Mahoney, and there's Mahoney with 2 N's, and so on. You can also want to make sure that you put in the O'Mahony variation. Now, when they were compiling the census, they didn't have a uniform way to do this. Some of them did this, some of them did that, some of them did an apostrophe like this. And so if you put in that, you don't always get the other variations. So if you want to try again the apostrophe, or say the asterisk, you will get the other variations. I'm not showing them there, but you will get them. So try that there as well. And if the name can be spelt with or without a Mac, you definitely want to include that as well. So don't make the mistake, oh, there's no Mac on my name now. There might have been a Mac in the past. They might have swapped with complete impunity between using the O and not having the O. And this is particularly true when people came to a new country. And I'm just called this slide the Ellis Island myth, but you know, it applies in Britain as well. So no names were changed in Ellis Island. And if you would like to Google that phrase, no names changed at Ellis Island, you'll find a whole host of proper studies on why they were never changed. But in particular relation to Ireland, the important things to remember there is that it only opened in 1892. And by that time, most people in Ireland were able to speak English, or there was only a small number of people who were only able to speak Irish. And they didn't compile names at Ellis Island, and they were just checking them off against passenger lists, so they weren't changing anything. But people did, when they came to new countries, they did anglicize their names, and this is often when they might drop an O or a Mac, and it would be to ease pronunciation, to sort of acclimatize them to the new country. And so we also see pronunciation changes quite specifically in America. So I mentioned the name Mahoney, and you would be perhaps more familiar with hearing that as Mahoney, which is the way it's usually pronounced in America. And then the other one that I've picked, which we always laugh at, is that we would say O'Shaughnessy in Ireland. And I think in both America and in the UK, we tend to get Shaughnessy. So again, think about that, and that could perhaps translate into there being a C somewhere in that name in the American translation. Something else that people did, and I should have put another one in here that's really common. So their name might be McGowan in Irish, and they might use Smith in English. This happens in Ireland as well, and that's because McGowan is the son of the blacksmith, is what that means in Irish. And so they would approximate that to Smith in English. So, but sometimes people, when they went to America, they did use McGowan, and then they started using Smith. Similar to that, I should have put it on the slide, sorry, is the change from Bridget to Delia, which sounds crazy. Bridget, Delia, but and we're not entirely sure. Some people think it's from the Latin, but the Latin for Bridget is usually just Bridget with an A at the end. But sometimes you see Bedelia in Latin, and we think it comes from there. So I recently worked on a case for someone, and their grandmother was Bridget in Ireland. Bridget on her birth certificate, she appears in New York as Delia, and uses Delia for the rest of her life, and it's definitely the same woman. So don't get confused with those two. I've covered some of these, but I just put them on the slide as well. I wanted to particularly show you this cool thing on John Grenham's website. So on the census, people are searchable by initials. And this is if they were in prison, or they were soldiers, or they were in hospitals or some kind of institution. Partly it was done for privacy, partly it was done for speed, because there'd be a lot of people to put on the return. But it makes it much harder to find people. So if we go back to our census page. And we just put in M and P, and we'll just select a county. See how you can find people who are down with their initials. And see Spike Island there? That's a prison. It's a famous prison in Ireland. Victoria Barracks, that's going to be soldiers, and so on. So when you see that, they're in some sort of institution, but maybe you don't know what sort of institution they are. And if we go back to John Grenham's website, he's got this really cool thing. It only works for the 1911 census at the moment, but he has got he has linked to the census returns for different types of institutions. So these are barracks here, and you can see there's absolutely loads of barracks. But if we say go to workhouses, and there were workhouses all over Ireland, and the bigger the circle, obviously, the more people there are in these places. But if we'll just click on one at random, and it says here's the workhouse in Longford. And he links to it. You can go here and it brings you directly to it on the census. It can be quite hard to find these if you don't know what the address, if you say, oh, I know that there was a workhouse in Longford, you have to know the address of it on the census to find it. But this is a nice shortcut to do it. And then if we click on this, we can start looking at the census return, and we can see here that all the people are listed with their initials. But I love this trick. And what's really nice about this is it doesn't just benefit genealogists, it also benefits social historians who want to go and look at the records of people who were in some kind of institution in the past. It makes it easier to find them. So does anyone have any questions, any comments on that? I'm going to put these links into the chat now while we're talking.
I had a question about Irish first names, because in these days we hear names, like Neve and Saoirse. And in those days, obviously, you didn't, they were all anglicized. So were the names that we hear today quite often, were they the names in the way past? And then once the British took over, did they become anglicized, or how does that shift happen?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of that, that they would have used, like if we go way back in time, to things like the Annals of the Four Masters and early historical texts in Ireland, we do see Irish names, and some of them, they became more popular in recent times. So Neve's a really good example. Like you hardly see any Neves at all in the records, but a part of it is I'm tempted now to look and see. Now that you've mentioned that, I'm going to put Neve in on Irish genealogy and just see. I bet nothing comes up. 31 hits on the whole of Irish genealogy, and they're all in the 20th century. So what we see is a resurgence of, after the Gaelic revival at the end of the 19th century, people start going back to older texts and say, okay, what were names that people use, and they start to increase them. So Eamon de Valera, our very famous president and former Taoiseach, he was baptized Edward, and then he just started using Eamon. So there's lots of people like that who are born in the last quarter of the 19th century, and they're known now by their Irish name, but actually, if you look at their records, they're going to have an English name. But what you do find is that those people probably in day-to-day life, even in childhood, were known by that Irish name. And I gave the example there with James and Seamus. That's very common. Like we know that Seamus is used all over the place, and Sean for John is used all over the place in Ireland in the 19th century. But the official records don't reflect that. They write their name in English in the official records. So that's part of what happens there. Yeah, I would say there's almost no one called Saoirse before 1950. It's even though it means freedom.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, so like there is an element of, we start using it because we have our independence, I think. So lots of nice names that have, as you say, resurged, and Siobhan, another one there that would be obvious. And again, it's lovely for us in Ireland that people are starting to know these names abroad, and that we don't have to pronounce them all the time.
Oh,
Because
right,
I knew
right.
someone who worked in the UK, and there was a girl called Aoife in her job. And Aoife is a very common Irish name. It's spelled Aoife. And but people look at that and they go, I have no idea how to pronounce
Yeah.
that. And it's actually, it's if you just pronounce it backwards, I think if
Oh,
you
that's
spell it backwards, it looks the same. So yeah,
Can
that
I ask just
yes,
one thing too is
please do.
when I was growing up in the 60s and that we had a lot of people, I mean, a lot of girls would be named names like Colleen or later Shannon and things. I mean, are those really Irish? I mean, where do they fit in?
So I would class them as Irish American, and I mean absolutely.
Okay.
I mean no disrespect with that, but they are. You don't see lots of people called Colleen in Irish, which just is the word for girl.
Right.
Um,
Mhm.
but you do sometimes see people who are called cis. And my dad had an aunt called Aunt Sis, and she was famously formidable. And I spent a long time trying to work out what was her actual name. And I thought, could it be Frances? Could it be Cecilia? No, it's just short for sister. And she
Yeah.
wasn't a nun. She was just that they called her sister, and then that became sis. And there was somebody else in the family called Sissy, and that was also just sister. And a friend of mine told me that her granny was the only girl in her family, and she was known for her whole life as Girly. That wasn't her name, but she was the only girl, and she was the youngest. So they just called her Girly, which is very different meaning, I think. So yeah, so Shannon, you would nowadays see Shannon, but you definitely wouldn't see Shannon in the past. So there is an element of sort of people in America and Canada going, what are things that sound nice that are Irish associated, I think. And that's where you, particularly Colleen, I think you wouldn't get very many Colleens in Ireland. Any other comments or questions?
Yeah, I ran into a challenge with the surname Whalen in County Laois. And
Mm-hmm.
the more I dug into the family, I found that the woman who was in our family by the name of Mary Whalen had been born as Mary Phelan.
Yes.
And she was married as Mary Phelan, and she was the mother of her first child was Mary Phelan.
Yeah.
But all the Irish records, um, and then the U.S. records, she became Whalen.
Yeah. So we would pronounce that Whelan and Phelan. And yeah, they are the same name. Yeah, I just came across that again there recently. She was Whelan in the various records, and then on some of the baptisms for children, Phelan. And there was no doubt that she was the same person. So they are definitely the same name, and they're just say versions of the same name. There's not any particular, this is the version we use in English, this is the version we use in Irish.
And so you say Whelan and Phelan?
Phelan, yeah. And then in Irish it would be O'Fuailán. So that's where that's coming in, is that it's got an F in Irish. Have a look at that on John Granham to see that. Let's put that in.
So the Irish is O'Fuailán.
O'Fuailán, yeah. So yeah, I'm going to do a quick screen share on this one again, and I'll show you. So I put in Whelan, and you see there it's coming up with Phelan as well. And then when we go down to the other versions, there's the O'Fuailán, that's the main Irish spelling today. But you can see this is one that's
Okay, so
absolutely,
that's the spelling, the Irish spelling for what
yeah,
we say as Whalen.
yeah. And so you see, John often has this here. You can see he has a bit from some books. He's referencing a book. Let me just get it. Hang on. So he's referencing this book, which is the standard work on Irish surnames. It's old now. It's from 1986. This is the most recent edition because Edward Glycett is dead, so he hasn't had time to update it.
Yeah.
But he also produced other books where he goes into sort of history of them as well, and there's a number of these books. You find them in libraries, but they're I had to buy them secondhand because I wanted my own copies of them. But sorry, could you see that there?
No. Okay. Okay.
That's the
Surname.
main book.
Mhm.
And then Edward wrote other books. And so this is just an example of one of them. He's also got a more Irish families. And this one really smells like a library book, even though it's my book. It has that library musty smell. So when John Grenham references this stuff in the surname dictionary that we saw there on the screen, he's often referencing Edward MacLysagh's work. I'll just put his name into the chat for you because it's a funny spelling.
Yeah.
And so you see MacLysagh there, you see that as Lysett, and you see it spelt with other variations of the second part of it. So it's quite an unusual name. Wouldn't be common at all. Yes, so yeah, right. Phelan and Whelan are the same name, which is a weird one, and well spotted. Anyone else got any thoughts or comments? No? Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording.